My son told me I wasn't welcome at his wedding. The reason? His fiancée's family didn't think I was rich enough to be part of their world. That statement hit me like a slap in the face. I was stunned, crushed, and to be honest, a little furious. So I did something, maybe underhanded, but at that point, I just couldn't help myself. Hello Reddit, this is my first time posting here. I really need some advice, and it's a bit urgent. I can't share this with my friends, so I'm hoping someone here can offer some perspective. My name is 52, and I'm a single mom. My son, who is 25, has been my world since he was born. His father passed away while I was pregnant with him, an aneurysm in his sleep. By the time I woke up, he was gone. Since then, I've raised him alone. I've worked hard. I've sacrificed. And as any other single parent will tell you, it's not easy. I never expected anything in return, but a little appreciation once in a while would have been nice. But that's not what I got. A few days ago, my son sat me down and told me he didn't want me at his wedding. His fiancée's family didn't think I looked rich enough to fit in with their crowd. How could he say that to me? It shattered my heart into a million pieces. Let me rewind. This all started 2 years ago when my son began dating Zoe. She's from a wealthy family. Her parents own one of the top real estate firms in the state, and they are rolling in money. Zoe, too, looks the part. Luxury brands from head to toe, a collection of cars, and a life I could only dream of. In contrast, I'm just an economics professor. I make enough to cover the bills and keep things afloat, but I don't have the kind of wealth Zoe's family does. Still, it had never been a problem. Until now. At first, I didn't think much of Zoe. She seemed nice enough, and I had no issue with their relationship. But things began to change between my son and me once Zoe came into the picture. It started with small comments, like when he called me after their first meeting. He said I needed to upgrade the house because it was too old-fashioned. He said my furniture was embarrassing because it didn't match the glamorous, shiny aesthetic of Zoe's parents' mansion. He wanted me to put more effort into how my home looked. I couldn't understand why this was suddenly an issue. Sure, my furniture was old, but I didn't think that was a reason to change everything. Some of it was from my late husband, and I cherished it. We fought. I told him, if you're so embarrassed by me, why did you even introduce me to her in the first place? He realized he'd gone too far and apologized. But after that, he started distancing himself. Zoe never came to my house again, and I only met her a few more times. I attended their engagement party, and that's when things really started to hurt. At the party, my son took one look at my outfit and immediately criticized me. "It's an engagement party," he said. "You should have put more effort into what you're wearing." I could tell it wasn't about my outfit, it was about the fact that I wasn't dressed in luxury brands. I didn't need him to say it, his words were already loaded with judgment. But I bit my tongue. Even though I could feel the distance growing between us, I didn't let it show. And then, just 3 days ago, he came to visit me again. He sat down and dropped the bombshell. Zoe's family didn't want me at the wedding. They thought I wouldn't fit in with the type of people who would be there, mostly Zoe's parents' business associates and their wealthy friends. He said he was respecting their wishes. There would be a private ceremony later, and I could attend that, but for the wedding itself, I wasn't invited. His words stung. It felt like a punch to the gut. When I started to cry, he became frustrated and told me there was no need for tears. "It's just a fact," he said. "You don't look rich enough to be there, and I don't want you to embarrass either of us." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was more concerned with his image than with how deeply he was hurting me. Once I stopped crying, I told him to leave. I couldn't even look at him. He tried to argue, but I screamed at him to get out. I didn't want to hear it anymore. And then, in the heat of that moment, I decided to take matters into my own hands. A couple of weeks ago, I had helped my son find the perfect venue for his wedding. He had been struggling with it, telling me that the place he wanted wasn't available. Zoe had her heart set on it, but the owner refused to rent it out for a wedding. No matter how much money they offered, he wouldn't budge. I didn't think much of it at first, but when my son mentioned the name of the owner, something clicked. I realized I knew him. We had gone to college together. So, I decided to take a shot. I reached out to him, hoping I could do something to help my son. After a few days of talking, I learned that the owner was hesitant to rent out his property because he didn't want any events ruining the beauty of the place. There had been problems in the past, and he wanted to protect it. But I vouched for my son. I told him that Zoe's parents were rich and respected, and there was no way they'd let the place get ruined. Eventually, after a lot of convincing, the owner agreed to speak to my son. I didn't know how this would play out, but it was my one chance to do something for him. I had decided to keep my involvement in the wedding a secret, wanting to surprise them after the ceremony. But once I had managed to convince him, he finally agreed. My son was thrilled, completely unaware of my behind-the-scenes effort. And that was probably why, when he later told me I wasn't welcome at the wedding, I felt like I had been struck with a cold, hard truth. It stung deeply, especially after he paid me that visit. I was crushed, and with a heart heavy from the hurt, I did something I hadn't planned. I called the venue owner. I explained everything. I never intended to overshare, but I was so upset that the words just spilled out. He, a man I wasn't particularly close to, had no idea what I was going through. Yet, somehow, he managed to comfort me. He and his wife were kind beyond words. They said they'd withdraw from the deal. They didn't want to be associated with someone so ungrateful. I was in shock, but I thanked them anyway. The next day, I learned that they had refunded the deposit and informed my son and his fiancée, Zoe, that they would no longer be able to use the venue. They had to find somewhere else. Zoe's parents were furious, livid, even threatening legal action. But the owners weren't fazed. The contract had been clear. They had the right to cancel right up until a week before the wedding. It was too late for any lawsuit. Not their fault if someone hadn't read the fine print. And just like that, the venue was no longer theirs. I couldn't help but feel vindicated. A sense of justice washed over me so strongly that I knew I had to write to my son. It wasn't just a letter, it was a message full of everything I had been holding inside. I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but the way he had treated me lately, especially after Zoe entered the picture, had hurt me more than I could put into words. So, I wrote everything. Then, instead of mailing it, I drove over to his house, knocked on the door, and left the letter on his doorstep. I knew this might be my final step with him. After I left, I blocked him from every possible way of reaching me. That night, he came to see me again. But this time, his demeanor was completely different. He looked broken, teary-eyed, full of regret. He said he had read my letter and was so sorry. He never realized the extent of what I had done for him. He apologized for how he had treated me and admitted that Zoe was upset, too. He begged me to talk to the owner, to fix the situation. With only 2 weeks left until the wedding, all their invitations had the venue address printed. They needed my help. I wasn't moved. Not anymore. I told him that his actions over the past few months, ever since Zoe entered his life, were hurtful. He had become someone I didn't recognize. I had raised him to be better than this, but now he had chosen sides. He was too ashamed to claim me as his mother because Zoe and her family disapproved of me. I reminded him of all the sacrifices I had made. All I had ever wanted was a little gratitude. But he had made it clear that he was ashamed of me. He tried to backpedal, promising he'd talk to Zoe and her parents, get them to apologize, but that didn't matter anymore. He just wanted me to fix things with the venue. But I had already done what I could. The venue was no longer an option, and I wasn't going to keep going back to the owner on their behalf. I had nothing more to give. That's when he snapped. His frustration was palpable. He called me unreasonable. He said I was being selfish, and if I didn't help, I would lose him for good. It stung, but I stood my ground. He was tired of balancing these two worlds, of dealing with pressure from both sides. But in the end, he left, telling me that if I didn't help, I'd never see him again. The door closed behind him, and I felt a pang of doubt. Was I being too harsh? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't let him manipulate me anymore. A week passed, and I hadn't heard a word from him. Not even a call to check if I would reconsider. I hadn't reached out to the venue owner either. It had been hard to decide what to do, but I had made my choice. I told myself that my son was an adult now. He could handle things on his own. The owner had made it clear they wouldn't change their minds, and I couldn't undo what had been done. I talked to some of my friends and family, explaining the situation. They were shocked when they learned the real reason why my son hadn't invited me to the wedding. He was embarrassed by his own family. He didn't think we'd fit in with the people Zoe and her family had chosen. When I told them about the venue, they all agreed that I had done the right thing. They were offended on my behalf. But I hadn't heard a word from my son. If it had been that important, he would have reached out to me again. Now, with just a couple of days left before the wedding, I knew it wasn't my problem anymore. He didn't want me there, and if he couldn't see me as family, then I had no responsibilities left. I was still trying to process everything. Being a single mother, he had always been my whole world. But in my heart, I had made my decision. And I would stick with it. It was 2 days before the wedding when, to my surprise, Zoe reached out. I had never expected this. If she and her family hadn't wanted me at the wedding in the first place, why would she reach out to talk now? When the phone rang, I felt an unsettling knot in my stomach, a strange intuition telling me it was her. Despite my hesitations, I answered the call, my voice as cold as ice. I could feel her trying to keep herself composed, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her emotions. She spoke softly, as if treading carefully, telling me she understood the rift between my son and me. She asked, pleaded even, for just one chance to speak with me and convince me to help fix things. Her words were peculiar, almost like a carefully rehearsed script. She admitted that she knew I had never liked her much, that we hadn't exactly hit it off from the beginning. But she said, with a surprising sincerity, that she truly respected me and had always admired me. And now, with everything that had happened, she was asking me to speak to the owner of the venue and try to resolve this mess. She spoke about how my son had forbidden her from bringing it up with me, yet here she was, trying her best to explain how disappointed she was that I wouldn't be at the wedding. Her words sent a shock through me, and I couldn't help but snap. I told her she didn't need to act with me. I knew full well it was her family that had made my son turn against me. She had been the one to tell him I wouldn't fit in at the wedding, the reason I hadn't been invited. She had caused all this, and now she was acting like she cared? There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. She didn't speak at first, but then she said something that threw me completely off guard. She claimed that neither she nor her parents had said such things. There had been some kind of misunderstanding. That's when everything started to unravel. She told me my son had actually spun a different story to her. He had told Zoe that I was the one who refused to come to the wedding, that I didn't approve of her or her family, because I thought they were too arrogant. We were both left speechless, realizing my son had been feeding us lies, playing us against each other. He had been so embarrassed that he had made up these stories, throwing Zoe and her family under the bus just to avoid showing the world that he didn't belong to their world. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My head was spinning, trying to piece it all together. I told Zoe I needed a break, that I would call her back. I needed time to digest everything. After about half an hour, I called her again, this time able to talk more clearly. I told her everything, how for months my son had made it seem like Zoe and her family had a problem with me, when in reality, she and her parents had never said anything of the sort. She explained how my son had convinced her that I didn't like her family, which is why she kept her distance from me. It was because he had told her I wasn't interested in attending the wedding, but he had twisted it all. He told her that he was going no contact with me, that I was the one who had cut ties. That was why she never reached out before. The pain in my chest grew heavier as I listened to her words. My son, my flesh and blood, had been the one to cause all this. Not his fiancée, not her family, just him. When I thought they were the ones who had turned against me, I could at least understand it. I could almost forgive him. But knowing he had done all of this on his own, without any outside influence, it shattered me. There was no more room for forgiveness. After our conversation, Zoe and I both realized how much damage my son had done. We apologized to each other for the misunderstandings, but we both knew the truth now. When we hung up, I sat still, numb. It felt like I had lost everything. Zoe, I thought, deserved better. She deserved someone who could stand up for her, not hide behind lies. As for me, what was left? I had been his mother. I had done everything for him. And this is how he repaid me. My heart ached more with every thought of all the sacrifices, all the love, all the effort I had poured into him. But nothing had prepared me for this betrayal. I knew it wasn't over. He would figure out that Zoe and I had talked. He would come to me, trying to fix things. But the truth was, after everything, he had lost the right to call my house his home. He had lost the right to have me as his mother. The next day, I woke up, still reeling from the conversation. It had been a rough night, the pain gnawing at me. But I knew what I had to do now. I had to stick with my decision. He had hurt me beyond words, and if he thought he could just come back and everything would be okay, he was wrong. And then, just as I predicted, the doorbell rang. The frantic ringing echoed through the house, and I knew exactly who it was before I even looked. It was my son. He had nowhere else to go. But this time, I wasn't going to open the door. I could see him through the intercom, standing there in front of my door with a mountain of bags at his feet. His face was splotchy, a clear sign of the tears he'd been shedding. But none of that, his tired eyes, his desperate look, could soften my resolve. He'd broken something too fundamental between us. This house, this place that had once been his home, didn't have room for him anymore. When he spoke, I could hear the raw desperation in his voice, cracking through the words. He was sorry, he said, for everything. He wanted to fix it all, make things right again, to undo the damage. I felt the weight of his words, but I steeled myself against them. He wasn't apologizing because he truly regretted what he had done. No, he was sorry because he'd been caught. Sorry because he was out of options. He told me how Zoe had kicked him out after their fight. I could hear the pain in his voice, but I wasn't swayed. He continued, talking about how difficult it had been for him, adjusting to Zoe's world. It sounded like an excuse, a plea. He admitted that in trying to fit in, he'd lost himself. He had become someone he wasn't, all for the sake of pretending. But what about me? What about the pain he caused me? I couldn't help but wonder. He apologized for his actions, for being selfish, for not understanding. He even admitted he probably didn't deserve forgiveness. But then he asked for another chance. A chance from me, his mother. He said I'd be more forgiving than Zoe would be. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. But I couldn't. His apology felt hollow, insincere. I couldn't let the desperation cloud my judgment. I told him plainly, maybe I'd forgive you someday, but not now. Not when it's clear that all you're sorry for is getting caught. I couldn't shake the feeling that if he were truly remorseful, he wouldn't be trying to justify his actions. He wouldn't be making excuses, telling me how hard it had been for him. He'd simply apologize and leave it at that. But no, he had to keep explaining. And that made me more certain that his words meant nothing. Then he tried bargaining. He promised to pay rent, to stay with me, to make things right. He claimed he was being genuine, that he could live with friends if he wanted to, but he wanted to come back home. I saw through the lie. Zoe had told me everything, and I knew he hadn't bothered to reach out to his friends. In all likelihood, they weren't speaking to him either. That's why he was standing there, begging for my help. We went back and forth for a while longer, but eventually, he snapped. He called me heartless and stormed off. I watched him walk away, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. He would survive. He had the resources to make it on his own. It wasn't my problem anymore. My job as a mother had been done. I had raised him, given him all I could, and for a time, he was a good person. But now? This wasn't on me. 2 weeks passed, and then I saw it, Zoe's post. She'd shared it with the world. She and my son had parted ways, and she asked for privacy during this difficult time. People reached out, their sympathy coming in waves. I felt something stir inside me, but it wasn't enough to make me reach out to him. Not after everything that had happened. Not after he'd stood at my doorstep and lied to my face. Since that day, he hasn't contacted me. Not a word. And honestly, I was relieved. He wasn't sorry. He was only sorry because his world was crumbling, and I was the only one who could have offered him any refuge. But I had turned my back. And he had stayed silent. I guess I had been right all along. I've been on my own for a while now, living my life, and the silence feels almost comforting. It's strange, but I'm not lonely. I have friends, family, my own routine. And my son? Well, he's not going to be part of that anymore. Not for now, anyway. Maybe someday, I'll find the strength to forgive him. But that day isn't today, and I'm okay with that.